We'll just have everybody sign in. Paul Flaherty here.
Rick McGuire here.
Nick Ensto here.
Jonathan?
Jonathan Calianos here.
Sean?
I'm here.
We got them all, Steve.
Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Upton Board of Selectmen's meeting. I'll call the meeting to order at 7:02 p.m. Stephen Metellian, aye.
Maureen Dwinell, aye.
Brett Simus, aye.
Okay. Pursuant to Governor Baker's March 12th, 2020 order suspending certain provisions of the Open Meeting Law, General Law, Chapter 30A, Section 18, and the Governor's March 15, 2020 order concerning imposition on strict limitations of the number of people they may gather in one place, meetings in the town of Upton will be conducted via remote participation to the greatest extent possible. We will strive to provide access to such meetings via a link to call in or other similar option. In the event we are unable to accommodate the same, despite our best efforts, we will post recorded sessions of the meeting as soon as possible following the same. Okay. And the agenda this evening, as I open it, we have a discussion regarding the amended Upton Regional School Assessment, a discussion on the override ballot question, and a discussion on the annual town meeting warrant. So 3 discussion items this evening. We'll start with the discussion reading regarding the school assessment. So as everyone here knows, just for those who may be watching, at a joint school committee meeting last Thursday evening, the Upton Board of Selectmen and Upton Finance Committee, along with the Mendon Board of Selectmen and Mendon Finance Committee, learned that the school override has been reduced by some $1.6 million. I believe our school assessment went down by $969,436. That was of last Thursday. I was unable to attend the meeting on Tuesday. I believe it was at noontime. So I'd like to ask Derek, I don't see you. Derek, I'd like to ask you if you could just talk a little bit about what you know, the most recent numbers regarding the override. I believe our assessment, we have budgeted $300,000 in our budget, but we still need to come up with an additional just over $200,000. So if you could talk maybe a little bit about that and talk a little bit about what our options are. How do we address that shortfall?
Sure. So, you guys know. So, as you pointed out, the school committee was able to readjust the budget down to, for the town of Upton share, approximately $202,000. I'm trying to show that on the screen right now.
It's there, Derek.
I just can't see it that well. So there's a number of different ways that the town could certainly address this, and I had mentioned one of the ways at the last meeting. We could certainly do an override for the balance, and I just want folks to realize that in our original override, we had approximately $57,000 appropriated or earmarked in the override for the Blackstone Valley Technical High School as well. So I think that we need to keep that in mind in this discussion, that although we're talking about $202,000 for the regional school district, there's still another approximately $58,000 that has to be considered as well. So, we could certainly focus all of our attention on the override question. I have to say that that poses a challenge for town meeting. I think it's going to be, it may be inappropriate to hold a town meeting in this COVID-19 environment with an override question on, right? So I think that's certainly one of the challenges with an override article, in addition to having the override as a ballot question as the second obstacle that has to be overcome. The second way to do this is to look at our reserves. And we have two sources of reserves. We have a stabilization account, which is just north of $2 million. And we have free cash, which is approximately $770,000, of which we have appropriated approximately $300,000, I believe. This is off the top of my head. Already at town meeting for acquisition of fire radios, turnout gear, and a few smaller items. And then, so that's the other option. We could go to one of our reserve accounts. And then the third option, which I think is the most concerning, would be to start to look within the town's operating budget and try to identify areas in which that we would have to cut right away. And I could say that I list that one last because that one I am most concerned about if Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen chose to go down that road, because there could potentially be 9C cuts in FY21. The state hasn't approved the budget as of yet. We would expect a late budget release, could be sometime around September. And then at that point, if there are 9C cuts in the budgets, in the governor's FY21 budget proposal, we'll have to respond to that. And typically the first go around with responding to 9C cuts is to look within our respective operating budgets and then adjust accordingly. I can tell you, though, if the budget as approved back in March from the Board of Selectmen and Finance Committee, if that goes to town meeting, which would be my recommendation, that we already have imposed a hiring freeze unless it's a critical worker. We have already imposed a spending freeze unless it's something that is of emergent need. So I can tell everybody who's listening right now that we are in no way approaching our budget expenditures like we have in years past, that we are holding back any expenditures unless we deem it absolutely of necessity. And so for those reasons, if we were to have to do 9C cuts at the November town meeting, we would have the ability to potentially absorb those 9C cuts just by the spending freeze that I and Kenny Costa have already imposed across the municipal departments. So those, in my mind, are the options for this evening that should be under consideration. Pending any questions, I'll turn it back to the chairman.
Okay. Thank you. So I guess I would ask Brett or Maureen, or did you want to make any comments or any thoughts, or do we have any questions for Derek regarding what's been happening with the budget and what our options are?
I just have a quick technical question. I can tell contextually, based on what you're saying, what 9C is, but talk a little bit, like, just from a technical perspective, what 9C means. I've never heard that term.
Right. Yeah, so 9C is the statute that allows the governor to make cuts to the state's budget midstream of an existing budget cycle. And so oftentimes in recessions, after a budget's already been approved, the governor will invoke Massachusetts General Law 9C, which allows, in this case, him to cut the state budget where he deems appropriate. And although the state would be cutting from its own budget, a lot of the appropriations within the state budget trickle down to the local level. And those types of cuts will affect us because, as you all know, we get Chapter 90 money for roads, and we get the undesignated governmental expenditure money, also known as UGA, which is approximately $570,000 to the town of Upton. So those are the places on the municipal side we would be exposed to if the state were to make these types of cuts.
And then
Hope
do
that
they,
answers your question.
Yep, absolutely. That's great. And then would it also potentially come through their school funding as well when they do those cuts?
Yes, absolutely. So that's absolutely could be the case that it's not just, the municipal side isn't just the areas of risk, but it certainly could be every school district across the state could be at risk as well through Chapter 70 cuts or anywhere else, again, the state deems appropriate.
Got it. And my only other comment, Steve and Maureen, would be I don't know where you guys are, but I think we talked last time. I mean, I don't think it makes sense to put an override question on the ballot or have it at a town meeting. So for me, I can just take that off the table. You know, the third option of trying to make cuts now, I don't think makes a lot of sense given that we may have to make cuts later. My view is that the reason we have a stabilization account and or, you know, to me, free cash and stabilization are you know, one and of the same, except that one takes a little longer to get than the other. So whether we use free cash or we use stabilization, you know, I don't necessarily feel strongly one way or the other, knowing that if we did deplete the free cash, if we need to, we would have to take money out of stabilization at some point for some other reason. But for me, that's where, you know, my head is at in terms of the options are that sort of option 2 with taking the money from either stabilization or free cash.
So,
Steve?
Maureen, you may- oh, there you
Yes,
go.
I would agree with Brett. I don't think there's a climate for an override, and I would not want to see any cuts as of yet. And I would be inclined to go with option 2 also.
Okay,
Steve?
that was actually going to be my first, give me just 1 second, Paul. That was going to be my first question, really was, well, I was going to ask Derek what his recommendation was, but we're a little ahead of that right now, but that's fine. I guess my first question is, does anybody want to explore the possibility of looking at the proposed operating budget and trying to find, realistically, it sounds to me, Derek, like we're going to need to find probably $260,000 roughly, because again, we do have that $57,000 that is also included in that override. So again, the Upton side of the increase, and just for those who may be listening at home, it's our annual increase in the operating budget that will be going up 500, a little over 500. So we're going to call it 502 or 505,000, whatever that number is. We already have 300,000 plugged into the budget. So we have that, again, that shortfall of 202 or 205 plus that 57 for Blackstone Valley Tech. So I guess that would be my question. And Paul, I'll let you answer it first, only because I know you have something else you wanted to say. So is there any appetite to try to look at the budget and try to find cuts there?
Not as far as I'm concerned. I thought Derek hit the nail on the head. Just let me back up a little bit here. That's on the screen, and the one that was up prior to that. I'm assuming that everybody from the Finance Committee and the Board of Selectmen were familiar with that. That was that spreadsheet there, the 4-column figure. That was the one that was discussed when we had the multi-board meeting a week ago. And the other document that's just showed up on the screen now, it's a 6 or 7 pager. That was the presentation that Dr. Marischek made on Monday at the school committee prior to the school recertifying the revised budget. And for anybody who wants to know, These two documents plus the assessment letter and I believe the line by line item, which is like 500 lines for the school budget. That is available for anybody to see on the Mendon Upton Regional School District webpage. Line and pick up budget and finance. You'll find them all on the. Should be on the left-hand side of the screen. So these are documents that are readily available for anybody to see. So back to your original question. I'm just going to basically reiterate what.
Paul, could I ask you to just hold up for 1 second? Hold on. If everybody could please mute their microphone, there's a lot of interference, Paul, and we can hardly hear you. So if we can just all mute for a second and go ahead, Paul, you can finish your thoughts.
I turned my microphone up a little bit. I don't know if that helps it. Generally, people don't have a problem hearing me, So, as Derek said, there's a couple of target areas to get this money from. One being free cash and the other being stabilization. And then if the only place in the budget you could possibly look at, and I personally would not recommend it, and I don't believe the manager would recommend it, would be there's a $500 and something thousand article for additional road money. Okay. We have made a diligent effort in the past several years to try to keep the head of the roads, to bring the road rating, as it's called, up to where it should be, and to, I think, to try to change that amount or reduce that amount would just put us behind. One thing that we should be all aware of, and I believe we are, that if we take the money from stabilization, you will create a deficiency going forward of $260,000, let's say. Well, that's just something you're going to have to deal with. I've always said, and everybody on the finance committee will agree, and I believe the board would agree, that you really do not want to use a one-time revenue to cover an ongoing expense. And by taking that stabilization money or the one-time money, that's what you're doing. However, Mr. Materian, you will well remember, I'm sure, that for many years you've heard me say, and Mr. Caliano says, preach that the stabilization money is there as a rainy day. This is to cover your rainy day. Well, I think if you probably look out the window, and I guess the sun's out now, but from the one aspect, it's raining. Now, it could be raining a lot harder next year. And we don't, so, that we'll have to address next year. But by taking it from the stabilization account, you're following through on the premise that this is your rainy day. The other thing is this. Most people on this call will remember that 5 or 6 years ago, we had an override and we didn't spend all of it because of Mendon Upton. However, that amount of money still stayed in the levy limit. In effect, because that money was set in the levy limit, and for discussion purposes, I know it's $460,000. Kelly, am I close on that? The exact amount?
Yeah, it's between 400,000 and 500,000.
So I look at it from one respect, and if you say it's 500,000 that was put in that was in the levy limit, and if we were there for 6 years, we collected $3 million. Now, I think if you trade 250,000 that we're talking about now, and say, well, gee, we collected $3 million, and we're going to have to give up 250,000. That's not a bad trade-off for trade-off where I come from. So my personal position would be to take it from stabilization. And with your permission, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to ask the rest of the Finance Committee if they'd be willing to weigh in on that. I don't care how we start. Sean, I see your green light there.
Yep, Paul, let me just, for those who are listening in, that I understand exactly what you're talking about. But for those who historically don't remember the story, for whatever reason, this is an override that was passed in Upton that wasn't passed in Mendon. So Upton took that money and we put it in stabilization. And it's really been sitting there for, I would say, over 10 years, maybe a little over 10 years, that money's been sitting in there. So I think given those two options, free cash or stabilization, I think stabilization is the more, even from a virtuous standpoint, that's the better decision. And certainly there's more in there than we have in free cash. So that's another, another factor that we can contemplate or discuss. But go ahead, members of FinCom, if you'd like to give some insight or opinion, and then I'll ask Brett and Maureen to, once again, let's talk a little bit about those two options. I take it, Brett, you had already said earlier that you don't have any, really no interest in looking into the budget to try to cut any money out of it. And Maureen, did I hear you say that as well?
Yes, I'm not inclined to cut the budget yet. That should be a last resort.
And
Okay.
just to be clear, I tend to agree. I'm guessing that we're going to have to do that in November. So I would rather use the stabilization now, knowing that come November we're probably going to have to respond to changes made at the state level. So I'd rather sort of deal with that when we have to and assess that at that point. But for now, I would advocate for using the stabilization money. So yes to your question, Steve.
Okay, very, very good. So members of FinCom, if you could, I can't see everybody, but if you could maybe throw a hand in the air, or at least I can announce your name. Jonathan, I see your hand. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Steve. I appreciate it. I don't disagree with anything anybody has said. I respect all the views. I think there's other avenues to think about. We've been doing this for a long time, and what struck me in this year's budget before COVID hit was that we were not putting a nickel in stabilization, and this was a good year. That was problematic to me. And now COVID's hit, and we immediately want to hit stabilization. We haven't seen the worst of it yet, folks. I hate to be the bearer of negative thoughts, but we are in a situation that we don't know where the outcome is going to lead us. But from all outward projections, we should always plan for the worst and hope for the best. And I think as we think about what the worst might be, we may need stabilization a lot more down the road next year than we do today. We have a lot of money in roads that we're spending. The article puts forth $562,000 this year into roads on top of what we're going to get from Chapter 90. The year before that, we put in $546,000 into roads that passed. We didn't spend all the $546 last year because some projects weren't completed. I understand some of the money's committed. There's probably about 70 grand left over from last year that he didn't spend. If we're thinking about things logically, or at least I hope, that every road project we bid this year should be cheaper. We should get more for our dollar this year than we did last year. Cost of asphalt had to plummet with the cost of oil. It's the byproduct. That's how they make asphalt. I'm sure we're going to see savings there. I don't know why we're not considering that easy goal to take some of this money out of the road budget this year, some of this $562,380, and use a good chunk of that to fill this $250,000 problem. You're still going to put a very good chunk of money towards roads, probably a lot more than we've done in the past. In the more distant past, certainly. Some years we put nothing into roads above Chapter 90. I know it didn't leave us in a good place, but we were in tough times and we did what we had to do. We're entering that situation again. We have money left over from last year, approximately $72,000. We're going to throw another 562 on top of approximately 300 in Chapter 90. That's over $900,000 in road money. And to my knowledge, I don't even know that we've even started paving anything yet. So our paving season may get off to a late start because of this COVID situation as well, because you just can't do any work. So you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but usually you'd be paving by now. I don't think it started yet. You might not even be able to do $900,000 worth of road work. And I think the problem becomes as you get closer to November, when you know what your 9C cuts are going to be, you know what the deficit's going to be and other funding options on the state, you can't look to this road money anymore because it's going to be committed. And I think it's an easy one now to say, hey, let's pull some of this back and leave our stabilization for the real monsoon that's going to hit or potentially hit. Let's be optimistic and hope it doesn't hit. And you know what? We'll still have a good savings account for the rainy day if we don't need it. I think that's a little too optimistic. At the end of the day, I think being more prudent now on just this one aspect, I'm not saying looking at the whole budget. This is an easy one. This is low-hanging fruit to me, that you can use some of it to fix this problem. And hey, why not free cash? We got 250 grand in free cash that may roll over. In distant years past, we never had that kind of free cash rollover. We had, 60, 70,000 in free cash, maybe. Some years a lot less. We've got a great free cash situation. Between free cash and roads, we don't have to touch our savings account. From a personal standpoint, when I'm in a crisis, what do? The last thing I'm going to do is spend my savings account. That's the last thing I'm going to do. If I'm in a crisis and I have the ability, I'm going to put more into my savings account. What you guys are doing is backwards. Now, I'll support whatever you do because I think it's an easy decision either way. This is not we could have a much bigger problem to solve. This is not a big problem to solve when we have tools to solve it. I'm just giving you food for thought. I'm going to go along with whatever you guys think is best. I'm just giving you alternatives that I think might be a little better to think about in this process.
Well, Jonathan, let me weigh in on that for just a minute. In years past, it's always been my experience, and as I look back through even our old annual reports, we've always done that supplemental road money, and I'm going to call it supplemental because it's money that we spend on the town side in addition to the state road money that, always ends up around 315,000. I think last year was 362 or something.
So with all due respect, Steve, I don't want to sound silly, but I've been on this committee since the day I came into this town. And I know for a fact in the early years, we rarely put in more than Chapter 90. So to say always, I don't think that's a fair assessment.
I'm saying over the last 6 to 8 years, we've put supplemental money in. But my point is not about the actual money, Jonathan. My point is the way we're paying for it. We've always paid for it out of free cash. And this year, it's a raise and appropriate. So we're not even sure if that particular article, we don't know if that will go through, and we certainly don't know if that article will pass, or if it will stay intact for those dollars. But I guess the question is, if how is the article actually going to be worded? It's still an override because, again, the operational side of the budget, and Derek, I think I'd like to bring you back in here for a second. As we look at again, with these sources, it's still an override. It's just
no. There's no override, Steve.
No override.
There's no override. Yeah. This isn't a levy, Steve. We've always funded in recent past. We funded extra roads in the levy. So this has been a budgeted item. 500,000 we started, and we've crept up. The 500,000 probably started 6 or 7 years ago. I think before that, if we threw 100 or 2 there when we had it, we did it. But it wasn't something that we did consistently. This is something we started probably, I want to say closer to 5 years ago, where it's in the levy, it's budgeted for, and it goes in every year.
Steve,
other members from FinCom want to, or is there anybody else that wanted to talk about?
Steve, might I just weigh in on something?
I think I see another hand, or did I see another hand? No. Go
Steve?
ahead.
Yeah,
go
Steve,
ahead.
to
just
make a comment when.
You said this is an override. With all due respect, sir, it's not an override. The article you would put forth would be to the normal school budget that has the 300,000 in it, And then you would have another article to transfer from stabilization this 202,000 to fund the Mendon Upton Regional School District, and either a separate article or a conditional phrase to transfer from stabilization the 58,000 or 57,000, whatever it is, for the supplemental appropriation for the Blackstone Valley budget. There's
Right.
no,
It's not an override in the sense,
no override at all.
right, in the sense that we're staying within the levy. But the fact is, it's still an increase of over 2.5% on the school budget. So I guess that's what I was actually getting to. Our 502,261 plus Mendon's 400 and whatever thousand they're putting in is still it's over 2.5% of an operating increase.
With all due respect, Steve, if you look back forever, there is no possible way that the school budget can stay within 2.5%. When the state government tells you what your minimum local contribution is going to be, you deal with all the other mandates that they put forward. All right, the school budget for all.
I sat through the same meetings as you did, Paul. We sat through them. I know 3 times the budget passed. I know. I heard it more than once. I don't mean to cut you off, but again, I've heard it 3 times on the budget presentation. But I know somebody was in queue there to speak from FinCom. Go ahead.
Steve, Steve, I don't know if you can hear me. I was in the queue. Just
Yes,
want to amplify a couple points that have been made. If we step back and we look at just the unemployment picture in this state, 730,000 people, that's as of last week, not including what happened today. You're looking at a recovery where some people are saying in government or Wall Street, well, it's going to be a U-shape. No, it'll be V-shape. But one thing it really points out is we don't know when this will end and when the economy will really come back. So I'm open for looking at using stabilization fund or the other option of looking at some of the highway funds or some other places in the budget. I will go with in either direction that the team wants to go in, but I think we ought to consider both areas. The only thing, if we go with stabilization fund, just to point that out, we will need a 2/3 vote in the town meeting to pull that off. I believe if we do make cuts to the road system or some other areas, that's within the purview of the people that are on this call.
Okay. And that was Rick McGuire.
Rick McGuire, right.
Those who are listening along. Okay.
David, this is Sean Craig. You want me to jump in?
Yes, go ahead. Sean Craig, go right ahead.
I appreciate it. First, sorry you guys can't see my handsome face this evening. I have a little difficulty with my webcam. I think Rick kind of hit on something just a moment ago. Question about which was the 2/3 vote that's required by town meeting in order to use stabilization. So my first question is, what would happen at town meeting, depending upon basically who shows up this year, as to if that were to fail, what could we do at that time? The other thing I wanted to ask about, and this may be good for Derek Kelly, but it used to be in the past that stabilization required, there used to be a cap on the amount that could be appropriated in the stabilization fund. I believe the Municipal Modernization Act ended that cap. I believe it was 10%. I was curious whether or not, by using a stabilization fund, perhaps in the future, we'd be able to take money from, say, free cash in order to basically backfill the 260 or what have you that we would potentially take out of that. Could either Derek, can I speak to that?
Yeah, so if your question is whether or not we can take money from free cash and deposit that into stabilization, the short answer to that is yes. We absolutely can take whatever our balance of free cash is and transfer that over to stabilization, which, as you all know, we have done. We did $500,000 last year, and then we did $500,000 the year before.
Derek, I think what his question was, ultimately, I think what his question was, if there's a little over 2 million, I think it's maybe 2.2 million in stabilization. What Sean's
Right.
question is, can you appropriate 200 and, what is it, about $260,000, where that may be in excess of 10% of the balance? Is that illegal with the Mass Municipal Modernization Act? Can we actually appropriate that money out of stabilization?
The short answer to that is yes, we can.
Okay.
I have never been told that we have since the Municipal Modernization Act, that we have a 10% cap still.
Okay.
So there are really two questions there. The first one of those that you're kind of touching on is backfilling. So, for my family, if I have a unexpected cost, a rainy day, I may decide to take money out of my long-term savings temporarily. Perhaps it's locked up a little bit longer, and I don't want to touch my, cash that's making nothing in the checking account. But over time, I will begin taking money and replenishing that savings account. So that's a bit where I'm coming from. Is if we take money out of stabilization, I wanted to make sure that there is no cap on what we could put into stabilization, and that if we do take money out, I think we need to consider make a conscious effort to replenish that, so we're not in the hole, as Paul said, 260 going forward. I'd like to see it replenished. The second one, which hasn't been answered right now, was going to town meeting required a 2/3 vote on the floor in order to use stabilization. If that fails, because I'm not sure how town meeting necessarily is going to work this year, who's coming, what would happen at that point if it fails? Or can we pivot at that time and go to free cash? What would happen on the floor?
So I think what we can do in advance is we can have the article read to transfer from reserve funds, and then the motion could read, at the first choice, the motion would read to transfer $260,000 from stabilization over to cover this cost of the education system. If that were to fail, we have the same article. We could just re-motion to then transfer money from free cash over to the education system.
Okay.
And Derek, I think we talked about this actually a little bit last year. Jonathan, I know you were in on this discussion as well last year. We talked about this. So Sean, the other issue as well is we pay each month to the regional school district. So we really wouldn't be short on money. We could actually address it in November. So hypothetically, and again, stop me if I'm wrong, Derek, but hypothetically, if that particular article failed for some reason, it does not pass by the 2/3 majority, we could address that in November. We know we have a shortfall in that budget. We could just address it in November with whatever funding means we have necessary. Would that be your understanding, Derek?
Yeah, absolutely. So the budget would pass through the operating article as presented, which would have a $300,000 increase. The only thing, if it were to be defeated, would be the $200,000 excess, the net that we need to gain. And like to your point, Steve, if both motions were to fail, we could certainly try to recover in November to try to make that, because at that point they would still get it. They would still have approximately $13 million approved just through the operating budget alone.
Just Steve, to that point though, come November, you'll have more limited tools because the road money will likely have been spent or allocated.
That's true, but we would be certifying free cash, so it is a trade-off in that respect. Jonathan, you're right. But then again, it's who knows how much of the road money, and who knows if that particular article will pass. If we don't spend that or don't raise and appropriate that road money, that, if my understanding is correct, that would leave us with excess capacity. But it also means people's tax bills, the levy to the people will be significantly lower. So these are all things, it's good that we're having these discussions. I mean, it gets a little bit muddy because, you know, we're bouncing around a lot of different ideas. So hopefully people are, you know, are following along and understanding what we're contemplating. Derek, while I've got you on the spot, what are your thoughts? If you were to, do you like spending out of stabilization in this particular instance? What are your thoughts on this?
So I have two thoughts. So my first thought is that for the past 2 years, I'll speak for myself, have encouraged to follow the DLS best practices and try to meet the goal of having a stabilization account upwards of 10% of the operating budget. And so the town has done that, you know, have really done everything they can to take the free cash that was left over and to try to meet that goal. Again, I personally like to advance best practices. And so because of that, we've done a good job in trying to reserve that money. And during those conversations, we had always said that the day comes when there's a recession. The last thing we want to do is cut services. I can speak for myself that the last thing I want to do is make a decision that we only have one police officer on the overnight shift, right? And there was a time in the town of Upton where we've had one police officer on the overnight shift. So I don't want to see the town get to the point where we have draconian cuts that we have to start cutting the operating budget because we're afraid to use the money that we have said will be there for when a rainy day comes. Well, to Chairman Flaherty's point, it could be pouring right now. And so let's use the money from the account that we always said we would pull from when the rainy day comes. So my recommendation would be to go to stabilization first. It also gives us flexibility down the road. If the state were to render cuts, then we have flexibility within the operating budget that we can then go ahead and address those so we still maintain those services and we don't have to cut services to our taxpayers. So I think for those reasons, it makes good sense. Now, certainly the roads is something that's come up a lot, but at the same time, you know, we could also consider OPEB, right? I mean, OPEB is one of those areas that we put money aside because we know it's a liability. We know at some point we have to pay, but it's also a luxury to pay into the OPEB account. So those are the areas that I would look if the state were to, again, cut us, that we say, hey, those are the areas, look at OPEB, look at roads in FY22, look at trash. I mean, trash is another issue that, you know, the last two budget cycles, we've looked at a $500,000 trash budget and said, is it schools or is it trash? So those are the areas that I hope that come July 1st, we start to sharpen our pencils and say, hey, let's start preparing on July 1st for a May 5th town meeting in 2021. So long story short, my preference would be stabilization.
Steve?
Yeah. Paul, hold on just 1 minute. I just want to find out, Sean, Craig, were you done with your questions, or did you have any other comments? And if you are, I'll turn it over to you, Paul.
Thank you. I think the only other question I would have, and again, perhaps best for Derek, in regards to our credit rating, I know that our free cash would be considered in that. I was wondering whether or not stabilization is also kind of to what extent that's taken into account, or if there's a heavier weighting to one or the other, how that would affect our decision here.
Did you say bond rating? Is that what I heard you say?
Credit rating. Yes.
Okay, yeah. So absolutely. So again, the DLS recommends that we have 10% of our operating budget in stabilization and 5%, an additional 5% in our free cash reserves. So do I think by taking $250,000 from stabilization one time will affect our credit rating? No. If we made this
Okay, go ahead, Paul. Yep.
There's been, we've talked about here about the road money and Chapter 90 money and that. I think you should keep in mind that anything you're getting from the state, I don't think you could consider that cast in stone right now. The Chapter 90 money, a lot of that is derived from the gas tax. We sell much gas these days? I don't think so. So to be depending on some of these things from the state may not be the best idea. Let me back up to the override from, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago. You seem to think it's 10, but we're both talking about the same thing. You may recall that the override we passed was for X amount of dollars. Our payment got reduced because Mendon failed at their first override, and the school came back with a lesser number, and then Mendon's override had passed on that amount. So because of the formula, the percentage formula, our appropriation was reduced to be in line with the formula because what Mendon passed. So that's how we had this extra money. And originally we set that into a stabilization account, and it was called school stabilization account. Okay. And then it stayed there for 3 or 4 years. And then somebody decided that maybe we should put it back into general stabilization. Okay, I wasn't a big fan of that, but it happened. So now let's back up again. We had that money that we told the people it was going to be for the schools. We started off to capture it in a stabilization account, and we called it school stabilization account. Okay, well, that money still got rolled into general stabilization. But there are still a lot of people around. I mean, I don't know how many people on this meeting right now were around, but I know a few of you were. To remember that we had said that was a school stabilization account. And I firmly believe that to keep our promise to the people from how many years ago, that we should take that money and apply it from stabilization now to keep our promise that we made way back when.
Okay. Let me ask Maureen, and we've gone around the table a time or two here. Maureen, Brett, what are you thinking?
Hey, Steve, before we move on to the selectmen, can I add my 2 cents?
Let Nick in.
Who do I have there? Is that Nick?
That's Nick, yep.
Oh, I didn't see in the chat box. Yes, go ahead, Nick.
So I think from a pure budget standpoint, in my eyes, the best thing to do, the most ideal thing to do, would be to move forward with an override this year. But I think that's irresponsible. So I think that's got to come off the table. I don't like the idea of taking from roads because we have a plan, and I think it's just the easy thing to do. And this is the tip of the iceberg. This is the beginning of a budget issue. Next year is going to be 10 times worse. And if you start taking away from our planned operations, by the time we get to next year, there's not going to be anything left to take, and we're going to be in a worse position. So I think, in my view, the best thing to do at this time, before November, is to use stabilization, give us some time to see what's going to happen, and then move forward in November and beginning of next budget season.
All right, very good. Thank you, Nick. Maureen, Brett, what are you thinking?
I'm thinking the stabilization fund also. and agree with Derek that we can fix things in November and start on next year's budget the 1st of July.
Okay. Yeah, no, so you're thinking that in November, we're going to have some budget issues we're still going to have to work through. Is that what you're thinking?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. And Brett, what are your thoughts?
I think, John, you made a very good, case for using the road money in the budget and foregoing some of the work on the roads. And I appreciate that and sort of consider it carefully. But I think at the end of the day, we've got the stabilization there. We don't know what the future holds. There's over $2 million in stabilization. Things could get worse. They could get better. There could be relief money that comes down the road. The economy could pick back up in another year or two. So for me, the short-term answer is better to use the savings account. And then that buys us some time to rejigger our spending, rejigger our cash flow, understand what our tax receipts are going to be over the next year or so as the economy starts to shift and change. And real estate prices will change, state revenue will change. There'll be a lot of moving pieces. And so, to not invest in roads, which I think people, value and appreciate, would be a harder sell, at least for the people that I talk to. And again, I only talk to the handful of people that I know around town. But my preference is to use the road money for roads. We've done that for the past several years. I think it's worked out great. I think the roads are making good progress. I think Dennis does a great job with using that money effectively. I have no doubt that he'll be able to get a lot of work done this year, if not more, because of that extra money that's available. So I'm with folks of the mind that we should use stabilization. So I'm still there.
All right, Mr.
Okay.
Chairman, Steve.
Yes, go ahead, Paul.
Might I address my next statement to the members of the Finance Committee? So, members of the Finance Committee, I move that we recommend to the Board of Selectmen that we transfer the $260,000 from stabilization to fund the deficiencies in the Mendon Upton and Blackstone Valley budgets. I believe the numbers are $203,000 for the Mendon Upton and at $58,000. So whatever that totals up. So that would be my motion. Do I have a second?
I second that, Rick McGuire.
Are there any more discussion with this matter with respect to the Finance Committee? Hearing none. All in favor? Paul Flaherty, aye.
Rick McGuire, aye.
Jonathan Calianos, aye.
Sean Craig, aye.
Nick Ensfield, aye.
Show it as unanimous vote. Here's your answer from the Finance Committee, Mr. Taylor.
Very good. All right, Maureen and Brett. I think the 50, if I remember correctly, Derek, at this point in time for us to motion, do we want to motion it right now or do you want to address this at our next meeting?
I was just pulling up the agenda. We place on the agenda, so what we don't have is that we don't have this type of article on the warrant. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, I was going to say my only concern is do we need to know the exact number, because I'm seeing like 502,261, which would leave us at 202,261, and I think 57,400 is the number for BBT.
Yes.
So, right. So I guess what I was about to say, I'm trying to pull up the agenda. So we don't have an article on the warrant to address this issue. So on the agenda, and it's taken a long time to download for some reason, we have a discussion item for the warrant. So my recommendation is that we reopen the warrant for 7 days, 7 full days, 5 work days, And then we can then place this as an article for this year's warrant. And then at that point, when we execute the warrant, we'll have this as an article with the appropriate number placed on it.
Okay. So
Mr. Chairman?
let me just see if I have, so we could actually move on to the next discussion item, which is discuss the warrant. We kind of can move away from this particular agenda item, move on to our next agenda item, and we can then go ahead and talk about, again, that very same topic Derek just mentioned, which is reopening the warrant. Okay, so Brett and Maureen, it makes sense. Obviously, we, at the same time, Derek, we would actually need to remove, so we would need to probably remove, but we don't have to do that right now, but we need to remove that other warrant article for the 1,200,229. So,
That's right.
okay. But in the short run, the easy thing to do is, as Derek recommended, Derek, are the days that we're recommending to open it, let's just say tomorrow, which would be May 8th through the 15th. Is that what you're suggesting?
Yes, that's my recommendation. Yep.
Okay. Any discussion, Brett or Maureen?
No, that's fine.
No, I make a motion that we reopen the Upton annual town meeting warrant for the period between May 8th and May 15th, 2020.
Second, Maureen Dwinell.
Stephen Mattelli and I.
Maureen Dwinell, aye.
Brett Simus, aye.
Okay. We'll make that unanimous action. Okay. And Derek, when is our next posted meeting?
We wouldn't meet again until, just look on the calendar, May 19th, I believe. Yeah, May 19th would be our next scheduled meeting. And
Okay.
so we can have that ready to review the warrant one last time, make sure everything is appropriate. And then I would propose that we execute the warrant on June 2nd based upon the decision that you made for a June 23rd town meeting. So that would give the folks approximately 3 weeks notice of the warrant. And just so we're clear, the bylaw requires 7 days. So we're given 3 times the amount of time required by the bylaw.
Okay. Brett or Maureen, any comments or questions for Derek?
No, I'm clear on that.
Yep, I'm good.
All right. Anybody have anything else? Paul, did you have anything else you wanted to add? I think you're muted. Paul, you're muted.
I know, I'm good. Just keep in mind that there's, there's an extra expense involved with, because we're reprinting the ballots and reprogramming the machine, and I've discussed this matter with Madam Town Clerk a couple of days ago. So, but keep in mind that there is that expense involved in it.
Okay. Right, obviously, because the override question will be removed from the ballot. And I think Kelly had mentioned that at our last meeting, the ballots have already been printed. So this is, the date on it. There's going to be a lot of things that are inconsistent on the ballot. So, all right. I seem to have lost my agenda in front of me. So, Derek, is there anything else we need to address tonight?
Yes, so there's a discussion on the override ballot question. So as you all know, this was a vote that was taken that we had to have a question at the town election for the override. So given the fact that we're not going to do an override, we need to rescind that vote.
I make a motion that we rescind the question on the ballot regarding the Proposition 2.5 override in the spring or June election for Upton in 2020.
Second, Maureen Dwinell.
Stephen Metellian, aye. Make that.
Maureen Dwinell, aye. Roll call, Steve.
Stephen Metellian, aye.
Brett Simus, aye.
All right. We can make that unanimous action. So Derek, when you open the warrant, you will just remove that particular question. Even right now with that vote, we'll just remove that question.
Yes, and just so you could, Kelly brought to my attention that the article does say to raise and appropriate or transfer from available funds. My hesitation to not just change that is that at the bottom of that existing article, which is Article 2A as it currently exists, has a lot of language about a Prop 2.5 override. So for those reasons, I feel like we should keep it open so it's clean, that we're going to remove that. And I will keep it as 2A. I'll just replace the existing 2A with a straight stabilization transfer article.
Okay. All right. Very good. Do we have anything else? Any other comments or questions or concerns? All right. Hearing none, I will take a motion to adjourn.
Move to adjourn, Maureen Dwinell.
Brett Simus, aye.
Stephen Metellian, aye.
Don't shut it off yet. Don't shut it off yet.
Okay.
All right, the Finance Committee, do we have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
We have a second?
Second from Rick McGuire.
All right, roll call, Paul Flaherty, aye.
Jonathan Calianos, aye.
Paul Craig, aye.
Rick McGuire, aye.
Nick Enstill, aye.
Motion to meeting's adjourned. Thank you very much, gentlemen.
Hey, board meeting.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.